In the sun-scorched Arizona desert, Harold Finch, a reclusive rancher, faces a deadly threat as cartel enforcers, led by the ruthless Mateo, storm his property, mistaking him for an easy target hiding wealth. Unbeknownst to them, Harold is no ordinary farmer. He's Phantom Six, a legendary Navy SEAL with a buried past of covert missions. As the gang tears apart his home, Harold remains eerily calm, calculating their every move. Tension crackles when neighbor Jenny Lee arrives, sensing danger. She races to alert her nephew, Captain Owen Ree. The stage is set for a reckoning as Harold's true identity begins to surface. If Harold Finch's story of quiet heroism inspired you, join us in celebrating unsung heroes. Like, subscribe, and share this video to spread their legacy. Comment below, what does honor mean to you? Your support fuels more stories of courage and kindness. Let's keep their spirit alive together. Swirls of dust spiraled across the parched Arizona horizon, stirred into a haze by the screeching halt of three battered pickup trucks outside a time-worn farmhouse. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and tension as six men spilled out, their faces carved with grim determination. Rifles clutched tightly in their hands, their boots crunched against the cracked ground, each step deliberate as they fanned out in a practice formation. At their helm strode a man whose swagger screamed authority, his eyes glinting with malice, as he zeroed in on the porch where an old man sat, still as stone. Harold Finch, silver-haired and weathered at 69, didn't so much as flinch. His silence was a wall, unyielding, and it unnerved the intruders more than any shouted defiance could have. "You're nothing but a washed-up old fossil," the leader spat, his voice dripping with contempt as he loomed over Harold. "Hand over your guns, your cash, now." The words hung heavy, meant to intimidate, but Harold's face remained a mask of calm, his pale blue eyes locking onto the thugs with an intensity that felt like a blade. Not a word passed his lips. The leader, unsettled by the lack of fear, ripped Harold's worn hat from his head and flung it into the dirt, a petty act to assert dominance. "You hear me, old man?" he barked, leaning closer, his breath hot with frustration. Still, Harold offered no reply, only that steady, piercing gaze that seemed to see straight through the man's bravado. Slowly, deliberately, Harold rose from his chair, his movements fluid despite his age, each motion carrying the weight of a lifetime's burdens. His presence filled the space, not with noise or fury, but with a quiet menace that made the air feel heavier. The gang had come expecting an easy mark, a lone, elderly man with cash and weapons ripe for the taking. But as Harold stood, his broad shoulders squared and his hands steady, something shifted. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado faltering. They'd come for money, maybe a quick thrill. Instead, they'd stirred something primal, something dangerous. By the time they realized who Harold Finch really was, the distance between them was too small, the moment too late. They couldn't run now. Far down a sun-bleached road in northern Arizona, where the dust clings to the air like a memory that refuses to fade, sits a modest ranch house, its weathered clapboard walls flanked by brittle gurns and stubborn cottonwood trees. The paint peels in long, curling strips, and the shutters groan when the wind shifts, their hinges rusted from years of neglect. But one thing stands unwavering. An American flag raised each dawn with precision and lowered at dusk, its colors crisp against the faded backdrop of the house. This is Harold Finch's domain, a place as unassuming as it is unyielding, much like the man himself. At 69, Harold is a figure forged from hardship, his frame lean but solid, built from years of carrying burdens too heavy for most, burdens he never set down, never shared. His silver hair catches the sunlight, and his eyes, sharp and unreadable, hold stories no one dares ask about. In Iron Creek, the small town nearby, Harold is a mystery wrapped in whispers. Locals know little of him, and he prefers it that way, keeping his world tightly contained within the boundaries of his ranch. He ventures into town only when necessity demands, his old truck rattling down the road for supplies or a rare errand. But when he does appear, it's never for himself. The people of Iron Creek still talk about last winter, when a brutal storm tore through the widow Martin's property, collapsing her fence under the weight of howling winds. Most folks would have waited for daylight, for calmer weather. but not Harold. Before the sun had even crested the horizon, he was there. Shovel and hammer in hand, a thermos of black coffee steaming in the cold. He worked in silence, his breath visible in the frosty air, rebuilding the fence plank by plank. When Mrs. Martin tried to thank him, he only nodded once, his face unreadable, before climbing back into his truck and driving away. No payment, no fanfare, just the job done. Then there was the time Thomas Riley, an old Marine with no family to claim him, passed away. The funeral home called the sheriff, unsure what to do with a man who died alone. The sheriff called Harold. Without hesitation, Harold arrived in a pressed white shirt and polished boots, his face solemn but composed. He dug the grave himself, each shovelful of earth a quiet tribute, and stood alone through the sparse service, his hand rising in a crisp salute before he turned and walked away. No one asked him to do it. No one had to. It was just Harold being Harold. 3 years ago, when a flash flood turned a dry gulch into a roaring beast, Harold's name became legend. 2 boys, barely teenagers, were stranded on the far side of the torrent, their shouts barely audible over the rush of water. The townsfolk gathered helpless, their panic rising with the water. But Harold didn't hesitate. He drove his truck straight into the flood, the current slamming against the chassis as he waded chest-deep into the icy water. With one boy hoisted over each shoulder, he fought the current, his face set in grim determination. By the time the volunteer fire crew arrived, Harold was already on the bank, wrapping the shivering boys in towels from his back seat, his own clothes soaked and clinging to his frame. He didn't wait for thanks or accolades. He just got back in his truck and drove home. To some, Harold is strange, too quiet, too solitary, a man who keeps the world at arm's length. Others whisper that he's haunted, carrying ghosts from a past he never speaks of. His eyes, they say, hold a weight that speaks of battles fought and losses endured. But even those who question him, who raise an eyebrow at his reclusive ways, lower their voices when his name comes up. Because in Iron Creek, when the world goes sideways, when the winds howl, or the waters rise, or the night grows too dark, it's not the wail of sirens the townsfolk pray for. It's Harold Finch, the man who shows up when no one else will, who carries the weight without complaint, who faces danger with a calm that borders on otherworldly. There's something about Harold's ranch that makes people pause, their voices dropping to hushed tones, not out of fear but something closer to awe. The place itself is unremarkable. A sagging barn, a slanted porch, a patch of land where cattle graze with slow, deliberate steps. Yet the air feels different there, as if the wind carries echoes of things unspoken, secrets carved into the very earth. The locals spin stories about Harold, each one more elaborate than the last. Charlie Newton, who runs the feed store, swears Harold once trained combat dogs for the Marines, his voice dropping low as he points to Harold's mutt. A lean, sharp-eyed creature that moves with a precision no ordinary pet could muster. "That's no house dog," Charlie mutters, shaking his head. "That's a soldier." Old Mrs. Vladimir, who spends her days sorting donations at the church thrift shop, has a different theory. She's seen Harold lingering near the shop's dusty bookshelf, his calloused fingers tracing the spines of worn war novels. He's a reader, she insists, her eyes bright with conviction. A man who lives in his head, piecing together the world through those pages. But whatever the truth, Harold Finch remains an enigma, a man who carries his past like a shadow, always present, but never fully seen. In the small, sun-scorched town of Dust Creek, Arizona, Harold Finch was a figure shrouded in whispers and half-truths. To the locals, he was just a tall, weathered man with a graying beard, always seen in his faded denim jacket, moving through life with a quiet deliberation that felt both comforting and unsettling. Teenagers spun tales around bonfires, claiming Harold once broke a man's arm with a single fluid motion, just for daring to threaten his wife. The story was never verified by Sheriff Wilson, a man with tired eyes and a penchant for dodging questions, but neither was it debunked. The uncertainty only fueled the town's fascination. Harold wasn't one for idle chatter or raised voices. He didn't argue or posture. Yet when someone crossed an invisible line, the townsfolk swore he moved with a chilling precision. Calm, efficient, no wasted effort, no warning given. He was the kind of man who didn't need to bluff. and his presence carried a weight that silenced rooms. But what Dust Creek didn't know, what even Sarah Thompson, his neighbor of 15 years who waved to him over the fence each morning, couldn't know was that Harold Finch wasn't just another loner with a military past. In another life, he was Phantom 6, commander of a Navy SEAL team so secretive their missions were locked away behind layers of classified documents, inaccessible even to most generals. For 23 years, Harold had navigated the shadows of global conflict, Somalia's war-torn coasts, Fallujah's crumbling streets, Kandahar's unforgiving mountains. He'd pulled hostages from burning compounds under a hail of bullets, eliminated high-value targets with surgical precision, and once, during a grueling 2-week stint behind enemy lines, dragged a wounded pilot to safety across a hostile border, his own body battered but unyielding. Each mission carved deeper lines into his soul, but the final one in southern Afghanistan broke something inside him. It was a blood-soaked nightmare, a mission so brutal it left invisible scars that ached in the quiet moments. When it was over, Harold vanished from the military's radar. He shed his old name, bought a sprawling ranch at the edge of Dust Creek, and built a life where questions were few and answers fewer. He craved silence, but silence, he'd learned, was a fragile thing. South of the Arizona border, in a world where loyalty was a commodity and silence a weapon, a man known only as El Tiburon, the shark, ruled with a cold, calculating patience that unnerved even his most hardened lieutenants. He didn't shout or brandish threats, he simply nodded and blood followed. His cartel had spent the past year creeping northward, not with loud, reckless violence that drew attention, but with a predator's subtlety. They targeted the vulnerable, isolated ranches, remote farmhouses, families with supplies or whispers of hidden wealth, people too far from help to fight back. Arizona's high desert became a silent war zone, where lives were traded like poker chips. El Tiburon's men moved like ghosts, and he preferred it that way. Among them was Nico, a young scout with sharp eyes and sharper ambitions. Unlike the cartel's ruthless enforcers, Nico wasn't driven by cruelty, but by a burning desire to climb the ranks, to prove he could see what others missed. One blistering afternoon, while staking out a desolate stretch near Highway 191, he spotted an old Dodge pickup parked on a dusty back road. An older man, tall and quiet, knelt beside a stalled sedan, its hood propped open like a wounded animal. A family stood nearby, worn clothes, weary eyes, likely migrants crossing the border in search of something better. Nico watched as the man inspected the engine, spoke a few soft words to the family, and patched a hose with electrical tape pulled from his truck. To Nico, the scene didn't add up. Why would a lone gringo stop to help strangers in the middle of nowhere? Suspicion gnawed at him. Maybe the man was moving something, guns, cash, contraband. Nico's pulse quickened with the thrill of discovery. He snapped a photo of the pickup's license plate with his burner phone and sent it up the chain, his heart pounding with the hope that this could be his ticket to El Tiburon's inner circle. When the message reached El Tiburon's table, the shark's eyes narrowed. The license plate traced back to a rancher in Dust Creek, a man rumored to be ex-military, living off the grid, likely paranoid and well-armed. The profile fit perfectly, a reclusive figure with the means to hide weapons or launder money. El Tiburon didn't smile, but his nod was enough. One of his lieutenants, a wiry man with a cruel streak, smirked and called the rancher El Fantasma Americano, the American ghost. The name hung in the air, heavy with possibility. El Tiburon didn't laugh. He simply said, "Send a team." Back in Dust Creek, Harold Finch stood on his porch, the desert stretching endlessly before him. The weight of his past pressed against his chest, a constant companion he could never outrun. He'd built this life to escape the ghosts, the screams of fallen comrades, the faces of those he couldn't save. But lately, the air felt heavier, charged with a threat he couldn't yet name. He didn't know about the photo, the license plate, or the men now watching his ranch from a distance. But he felt the shift, the way a predator senses a storm before it breaks. And Harold Finch, Phantom 6, was no stranger to storms. Mateo's voice was cold and flat when he spoke the name, like he was reciting a fact he'd memorized but didn't care to understand. Mateo was a retrieval specialist, a title that carried a certain weight in the circles he ran. Subtlety wasn't his game, nor was kindness. Efficiency, though, that was his currency. He moved with a predator's certainty, leaving no room for doubt or hesitation. In the past year alone, he'd torn through 5 properties, each job executed with brutal precision. 3 of those raids had ended in silence. No witnesses left to whisper his name. His reputation was a shadow that stretched long and dark, and he wore it like armor. Yet beneath that confidence, there was a flicker of unease he'd never admit, a nagging sense that every job carried a hidden cost he hadn't yet paid. The next morning, 3 battered trucks rolled out under a sky bruised with dawn's early light. Inside, 6 armed men sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces set in grim determination. Their orders were clear, etched into their minds by Mateo's sharp tongue. Find out what the old man was hiding, seize anything of value, and if he dared resist, leave nothing but ashes in their wake. Each man carried his own private thoughts, a mix of greed, fear, and the adrenaline that came with the promise of violence. They imagined the old man as easy prey, a frail rancher hoarding some secret fortune in his dusty home. What none of them knew, not even Mateo, was that they weren't heading toward a victim. They were speeding straight into the heart of a legend's domain, a place where the ground itself seemed to hold its breath. The earth gave a faint shudder before the roar of engines reached Harold Finch's ears. Standing on his porch, he gripped a steaming mug of black coffee, the heat seeping into his calloused hands. His eyes, narrowed against the rising sun, tracked the horizon with a patience born of decades. He'd heard the tires long before the trucks came into view, their growling approach stirring memories he'd buried deep. 3 rusted vehicles tore down the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust that swirled like smoke in their wake. They moved in a staggered formation, fast and deliberate. Not locals, not lost. Trouble. Harold didn't flinch. At 72, his frame was lean but unyielding, his face carved with lines that told stories he rarely shared. Inside, his heart beat steady, but his mind was already turning, cataloging every detail with the precision of a man who'd faced death and walked away. The trucks skidded to a halt, spraying gravel across his driveway in a loose semicircle meant to intimidate. 6 men spilled out, young and armed, their faces twisted into sneers that barely hid their nerves. They carried themselves with the arrogance of youth, believing their guns made them invincible. The leader, Mateo, stepped forward, his dark sunglasses glinting in the sunlight, his bulletproof vest too pristine to have seen real combat. He moved with the swagger of someone used to giving orders, and worse, used to being obeyed without question. Inside, though, Mateo felt a prickle of doubt. This job was supposed to be simple, but something about the old man's stillness unnerved him, like standing too close to a coiled snake. "So, this is the famous old rancher," Mateo said, his smirk sharp but brittle. "I thought you'd be taller." The words were meant to provoke, to assert dominance, but they hung in the air unanswered. Harold stood motionless, his silence louder than any retort. His gray eyes held Mateo's gaze, calm and unreadable, a depth in them that made the younger man's bravado waver. Mateo's heart gave a single unsteady thud, but he pushed the feeling down, refusing to let it take root. His eyes flicked to a rusted dish on the porch table, catching a glint of metal. A Navy SEAL challenge coin, its edges worn smooth by time and touch, lay there, a relic of a life Mateo couldn't begin to comprehend. With a casual flick of his fingers, he picked it up, rolling it across his palm like a cheap trinket. The weight of it surprised him, but he masked it with a scoff. "Doesn't mean much out here, does it?" he said, tossing the coin into the dirt at Harold's feet. He ground it into the earth with his boot, a deliberate insult meant to break the old man's composure. Harold's face didn't change. Not a flicker of rage, not even a frown. But Mateo's harsh smirk faltered for a heartbeat, a crack in his armor he quickly hid. "Search the house," he barked, his voice sharper than intended. His men moved like a storm, kicking in doors, tearing cabinets from walls, and slashing open a mattress with a knife, its stuffing spilling out like entrails. One of them, a wiry man named Lewis, overturned Harold's bookshelf with a grunt, sending photographs, folded letters, and a well-worn Bible crashing to the floor. Lewis paused, his eyes lingering on a faded picture of a young couple, but Mateo's glare spurred him on. "He's hiding something," Lewis muttered, his voice tight with the pressure to deliver. "Check the barn, check the well." Mateo's order came fast, laced with impatience. Tear it apart. He's got cash, weapons, anything. Harold stood like a sentinel, his coffee untouched by the chaos. His life, quiet and hard-earned, was being ripped apart, but he didn't move. Behind his calm exterior, though, his mind was a battlefield. He noted every detail, the weight of their weapons, the rhythm of their steps, the way Lewis's finger hovered too close to his trigger, betraying his inexperience. Harold's thoughts churned with memories of missions long past, of nights when hesitation meant death. He didn't interrupt their rampage. Not yet. Because Harold Finch wasn't just watching. He was waiting, his patience a weapon sharper than any blade. They didn't realize it, but they'd already stepped into his kill box, a trap woven from instinct and experience. In the back room of Harold's modest home, a cartel man named Javier wrestled with a pry bar, his muscles straining against a heavy chest bolted to the floor. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes as he cursed under his breath. The lid gave way with a sharp crack, and Javier's heart leaped, expecting riches or weapons. Instead, he found a neatly folded American flag, its stars faded but proud. Beneath it lay a stack of photographs, laminated field maps, and rows of medals, their surfaces gleaming even in the dim, dust-filtered sunlight. A silver star, a bronze star with valor, a Navy cross, each one a testament to battles fought and brothers lost. Tucked beneath them was a faded black and white photograph, a group of grim-faced SEALs kneeling in desert gear, rifles slung across their chests. In the center stood a younger Harold, one man taller than the rest, his gaze sharp and unyielding, even in monochrome. Javier's excitement turned to confusion, then unease. These weren't the spoils he'd been promised. He glanced back at Mateo, who was still outside, shouting orders. Javier's hands hesitated over the medals, his fingers brushing the cold metal. He wondered what kind of man kept such things hidden, not for display, but for memory. Lewis, the youngest of the group, peered over Javier's shoulder, his face pale. "This guy's a ghost," he whispered, his voice trembling with a fear he couldn't name. The room felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were closing in, and both men sensed, deep down, that they'd underestimated the quiet man on the porch. The photograph trembled in Crew's grip, as if it had suddenly ignited, its edges curling with an invisible flame. His throat tightened, voice splintering like dry timber. "Boss, we screwed up bad. This guy, he ain't just some dirt farmer." The words tumbled out, heavy with dread, his heart hammering as he stared at the faded image of Harold Finch, a man whose unassuming face now seemed to hide 1,000 untold secrets. Crew's mind raced, piecing together fragments of rumors he'd dismissed as barroom tales, each one now clawing at his certainty. Mateo, lounging against a rusted chair, barely flicked his eyes toward Crew before snatching the photo. His gaze skimmed it with the indifference of a man who'd seen too many faces to care about one more. A sneer curled his lip. Some old man's ghost story, probably cooked up to scare kids. Garbage. He crumpled the photo and let it flutter to the ground, where it landed among scattered scraps of metal and dust. Stepping over the debris, he jerked his head toward the door, his voice cold and final. "Drag him out. Let's wrap this up." Mateo's confidence was a blade, sharp and unyielding, but beneath it simmered a flicker of unease he refused to acknowledge. This job was supposed to be simple. Tie up loose ends, send a message. Yet something about Harold's quiet defiance gnawed at him, like a shadow moving just out of sight. Outside, the desert sun blazed mercilessly, its heat twisting the air above the cracked driveway into shimmering waves. The wind, which had howled earlier, now fell silent, as if the land itself were holding its breath, watching the scene unfold. Harold Finch knelt in the dirt just beyond the sagging porch of his weathered farmhouse, his wrists bound tight with coarse rope that bit into his skin. His flannel shirt clung to his frame, soaked through with sweat and streaked with the reddish grit of the desert. He didn't flinch, didn't beg, but his chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of a man who'd faced worse than this and lived. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, tracked every move the men made, cataloging their weaknesses with the precision of a predator. One of Mateo's crew, a wiry man with a scarred cheek, popped the cap off a rusted gas can, the sharp tang of gasoline cutting through the dry air. He sloshed the liquid over the porch steps and railings, the wood drinking it in with a dull glisten. Another thug, burly and sweating through his faded tank top, pulled a grimy rag from his pocket and stuffed it into the neck of an empty whiskey bottle. With a flick of his lighter, a small flame danced to life, licking the rag's edge. The sight sent a jolt through Harold, but his face remained carved from stone, his thoughts a fortress no one could breach. He'd built this house with his own hands, every nail and board a testament to years of toil. To see it doused in fuel, ready to be erased, stirred a quiet fury deep in his gut, but he buried it, knowing anger would only cloud his focus. "You burn this place, you'll wish you hadn't," Harold said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of a promise rather than a threat. His words hung in the air, soft but unyielding, like the first rumble of a distant storm. Mateo's lips twisted into a mocking grin, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "The only thing I'll regret is wasting my morning listening to your fairy tales, old man." But for a fleeting moment, as Harold's gaze shifted to Louise, one of Mateo's crew, a wiry figure with haunted eyes, something passed between them. Louise's jaw tightened, and she looked away, her fingers twitching at her side. She'd been with Mateo for years, loyal out of necessity, but Harold's calm defiance stirred memories she'd long buried, of a life before blood and betrayal. The wind stirred again, hot and dry, tugging at the edges of their clothes. The thug with the Molotov raised it, the flame growing brighter, ready to fall. But before it could, the air seemed to shift, not with sound or movement, but with a primal tension, as if the desert itself had drawn a breath and held it. The crunch of tires on gravel shattered the moment, sharp and sudden, like a gunshot in the silence. Heads turned as a blue pickup rolled into view, emerging from behind a gnarled sycamore tree that stood sentinel at the edge of the property. The engine growled low, steady, as the truck crawled up the long dirt driveway, kicking up a plume of dust that swirled through the heat like a warning flare. Behind the wheel sat Jenny Lee, 58 years old, her face etched with the lines of a life spent under the desert sun. She ran the nursery supply store in town, a no-nonsense woman who knew the weight of hard work and the value of silence. For 15 years, she and Harold had been neighbors, not friends exactly, but bound by the quiet respect of shared fences, borrowed tools, and the occasional nod across the property line. Jenny knew Harold didn't talk much, didn't need to. He was a man who fixed his own problems, who never asked for help, and who never looked like he couldn't handle whatever came his way. So when her eyes landed on the scene before her, Harold on his knees, hands bound, surrounded by armed strangers, the porch reeking of gasoline, smoke curling from a Molotov in one man's hand, her blood turned to ice. Her foot eased off the gas, the truck slowing as her mind scrambled to make sense of the nightmare unfolding. One of Mateo's men stepped forward, his hand hovering near the pistol tucked into his waistband, his posture a silent warning. Jenny's heart pounded, but she kept her face neutral, her hand steady on the wheel. Before she could open the door, Harold's voice cut through the tension, calm as a still lake. "Just business, Jen. Come back tomorrow." His tone was even, measured, but beneath it ran a current of urgency, a message meant only for her. "Run. Now." Jenny's throat tightened, but she forced a smile, the kind of smile women learn to wear when they sense a blade hidden just out of sight. "Just returning your post, hole digger," she called, lifting the tool from the passenger seat for the men to see. Her voice didn't waver, but her mind screamed, every instinct urging her to floor the way and get out. Mateo sauntered toward her truck, his grin slick and predatory, like a coyote circling a wounded animal. "We're just having a little chat, senora. Your friend here's got a stubborn streak." His words dripped with false charm, but his eyes were cold, calculating. Jenny nodded slowly, her gaze flicking to Harold one last time. "All right then," she said, shifting the truck into reverse. "I'll see you tomorrow, Harold." She backed out with deliberate care, her eyes locked on his until the curve of the driveway stole him from view. But the moment she was clear of the property, her composure cracked. Her hands shook so badly she could barely steer, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She didn't head home. Instead, she gunned the engine toward the only gas station within 20 miles, her mind racing with the certainty that time was slipping away. By some stroke of fate, or perhaps something more, help was already waiting. At Pump 2 stood her nephew, Captain Owen Ree, fresh from deployment, his National Guard uniform crisp despite the desert heat. He was fueling up his Jeep, his broad frame exuding the quiet confidence of a man who'd seen chaos and walked through it unbroken. Jenny didn't bother parking. Her truck screeched to a halt, tires spitting gravel, and Owen's head snapped up, his instincts kicking in before she even spoke. The look on her face, raw, unfiltered fear, told him everything he needed to know. Something was wrong and it was bad. Jenny leaped from her truck, her boots kicking up clouds of dry earth as she seized Owen's arm with a grip that betrayed her panic. "Owen," she gasped, her voice raw and breathless, her hazel eyes wide with a fear that made his stomach twist. "Something's going down at Harold's place. It's bad." The way she spoke Harold's name sent a shiver through Captain Owen Ree. He'd seen too much in his years of service. Deserts scorched by war, faces hollowed by loss, to mistake the weight in her tone. Harold wasn't just a neighbor to Jenny, he was a man with a past, and Owen knew the look in her eyes. It was the look of someone staring down a storm that might bring destruction home. No sooner had Jenny's truck tires stopped churning the dust than another engine growled over the ridge, low and urgent, like a predator closing in. A sand-colored Jeep tore through the dirt road, its headlights blazing against the biting wind that carried the scent of the plains. Owen was at the wheel, his crisp uniform a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. His jaw was set, his knuckles pale as he gripped the steering column, every nerve alight with the instinct that had kept him alive through 2 tours. The sidearm strapped to his hip wasn't just regulation, it was a cold, reassuring weight, a tool for moments like this. In the passenger seat, Corporal Dean Carter sat silent, his young face unreadable but taut. Dean was a local, raised on these unforgiving lands, and he didn't need to ask why Owen's voice had hardened when he said, "We're heading into something ugly. Carter, stay sharp." Dean just nodded, his hand steady, his trust in Owen absolute. As the Jeep surged over the hill, the farmhouse loomed into view, a weathered structure that seemed to hold secrets in its sagging boards. Owen's instincts roared to life, honed by years of assessing threats in a single glance. 6 men stood in the yard, their rifles glinting in the fading light. One hostage knelt, wrists bound, his head bowed. Fuel cans were scattered near the porch, their acrid stench mingling with the air, and the wood was slick with gasoline. Worst of all, one of the men held a lit bottle, its flame dancing like a promise of ruin. Owen's face tightened. This wasn't a shakedown or a petty theft. This was a death sentence waiting to ignite. Owen slammed the Jeep to a stop, the door flying open before the engine's echo faded. Every eye in the yard snapped to him, even the hostages, though his face remained shadowed. Matteo Bianchi, the apparent leader, strode forward, his chest puffed like he owned the earth beneath his boots. "This is private land," he barked, his voice thick with disdain. "Military's got no place here." His sneer was bold, but then Owen didn't bite. Not yet. His gaze had dropped to the dirt near the porch, where something gleamed amid the dust. Medals. Not cheap replicas, but the real deal. Service stars, unit insignias, a Navy cross catching the sun like a beacon. Each one was a piece of someone's soul, earned in blood and sacrifice. But it was the photograph that stopped Owen's heart mid-beat. Crumpled and dirt-streaked, it showed a SEAL team in Fallujah, their faces carved with the weight of war, gear battered but eyes unbroken. In the center stood a man, younger, leaner, but unmistakable. Harold Finch. Owen's pulse thudded, heavy and singular, like a drum in his chest. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dry ground, and his voice came low but steady, cutting through the tension. "Sir, are you Commander Harold Finch? Phantom 6? The hostage lifted his head, and Owen felt the air shift. Harold's face was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of battles fought and burdens carried. But his eyes, ice blue and piercing, held a history that made Owen's spine straighten. Ghosts lingered there, memories of fire and loss, but also a quiet strength that needed no words. Harold gave the faintest nod, and in that moment, Owen's world narrowed to the man before him. Without hesitation, he snapped to attention, his salute crisp and reverent. "Sir, it's an honor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My father, Major Ree, told me about you. Said you dragged him out of a collapsed tunnel in Kandahar, carried him 5 miles through enemy lines. He owed you his life. The cartel men exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado faltering. Mateo scoffed, stepping closer, his lip curling. He's just a farmer, some old man playing at being a soldier. But Owen didn't even glance at him. His eyes were locked on Harold, his voice rising with a quiet fury. This man, he said, each word deliberate, is a war fighter, a commander, and if you don't walk away right now, he's not the one you'll need to worry about. The threat hung in the air, heavy and unshakable, and Owen felt the weight of his own words settle into his bones. He wasn't just defending Harold. He was honoring a legacy. Harold said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence was a force, his reputation a shadow that loomed larger than the men who thought they could break him. The silence stretched, taut and electric, like the moment before a storm decides to unleash its fury. Owen knelt, his fingers brushing the dirt as he lifted the photograph Mateo's men had tossed aside. He dusted it off with his sleeve, his movements careful, almost sacred. The image showed Harold, decades younger, soaked in sweat, dragging a wounded pilot across jagged terrain as tracer rounds lit the sky. Syria, Operation Ashfall, Owen said, his voice tight with reverence. He carried Lieutenant Parrish 2 miles with a collapsed lung and a shattered femur. They gave him the Silver Star, but the story never went public. That's who this man is. Another photo caught the wind, fluttering against the barn. A younger cartel member, Luis, snatched it from the air, his eyes widening as he studied it. It showed Harold breaching a compound, his face set with grim determination, a team of operators at his back. Luis's hand trembled slightly, and Owen saw the flicker of doubt in his gaze. The truth was sinking in. Harold Finch wasn't just a farmer. He was a legend, and the men who'd come to burn his home were standing on the edge of a reckoning. The heavy compound door loomed ahead, its rusted iron surface glinting faintly under the harsh Colombian sun. Flanking it stood 2 hulking mass seals, their presence like silent sentinels guarding a fortress of secrets. Luis's eyes darted to the hostage kneeling in the dirt, the patch on his tattered uniform screaming, "Bogota, Colombia!" His heart lurched, a cold sweat prickling at the base of his neck. No, 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 this can't be right, he thought, his mind spiraling as recognition hit like a punch to the gut. He'd seen this man before, not in person, but in the hushed, almost mythical stories his uncle used to tell late at night, when the fire crackled low and the world felt too still. They called him Viento Fantasma, ghost wind, a specter who moved through walls, leaving behind only bodies and whispers, no trace of his passage. Luis's stomach churned with a mix of awe and dread. His uncle's voice echoed in his mind. The Americans had a ghost, mijo. No footprints, no face, just death. Beside him, Mateo let out a sharp, forced snort, trying to mask his unease with a laugh that sounded more like a cough. Just old tales to spook kids, he said, his voice loud enough to convince himself. But his bravado faltered, his eyes flickering toward the hostage, who hadn't moved an inch. Luis shook his head, his throat tight. No, Mateo, they never even knew his name. All they saw was what he left behind. Emptied hideouts, vanished caches, bodies stacked like firewood. His mind raced, piecing together the stories. Ghostwind had dismantled the Ortega Bridge cell in just 3 nights, alone. No one knew how. The weapons, the kish, it had all gone up in flames after he freed the hostages, leaving nothing but ash and questions. Raul, another of the cartel's men, stood nearby, his face draining of color until it matched the pale dust beneath their boots. Wait, he whispered, his voice barely audible. That's him? His hands trembled, the rifle in his grip wavering as if it suddenly weighed too much. One by one the others followed suit, their weapons dipping toward the ground, their confidence unraveling like a frayed rope. Harold, the hostage, remained still, his posture unyielding despite the ropes binding his wrists. Captain Reese stood beside him, arms crossed, his weathered face carved with a quiet certainty. He turned to Mateo, his voice steady, but laced with a warning that cut through the humid air. You need to understand something, he said, his tone calm, yet heavy with implication. This man isn't known for his words. He's known because no one's ever lived long enough to spread them. Mateo's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening around the grip of his pistol. He wanted to stand tall, to project the unshakable confidence that had carried him through countless deals and ambushes. But doubt crept in, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. His shoulders sagged, just enough to betray him. Above, the wind shifted, carrying the distant cry of a hawk circling lazily in the cloudless arm. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was oppressive, thick with the weight of something inevitable, like the moment before a guillotine drops. Then it broke. Javier, one of the cartel's enforcers, stumbled backward, his rifle slipping from his hands to land with a dull thud in the dirt. His eyes were wide, his breath ragged. "I'm not dying for this," he muttered, his voice trembling with a fear he couldn't hide. Another man followed, then another, their weapons abandoned as they backed away, their bravado crumbling under the weight of the stories they'd all heard but never believed. Until now. Harold exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that seemed to pull the air from the world around him. He rose to his feet with a measured grace. No hint of theatrics, no need for threats. The way his boots settled into the dust, the slight bend in his knees, the subtle roll of his shoulders, it was all precise, deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. His presence shifted the air, turning the standoff into something else entirely. A reckoning. Mateo took half a step back before catching himself, his hand twitching near his pistol, but hesitating to draw. The others weren't so bold. Two of the cartel men were already retreating toward the trucks, their footsteps kicking up clouds of dust. Another looked like he might collapse, his face pale, his stomach visibly churning. When Harold spoke, his voice was low, unshakable, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "You came here thinking I was weak," he said, his pale blue eyes sweeping across the group, pinning each man in place. "You thought I was alone, soft, an easy mark." His gaze was unrelenting, and under it, the men froze, their bravado stripped bare. They didn't understand what they were facing, not until this moment, when the weight of his presence pressed down on them like a physical force. "You've got one chance," Harold continued, his tone even but laced with a quiet menace. "Walk away. Forget this place. Don't come back." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Harold took a single step forward. Just one. But it was enough. The way he planted his foot, the way his hands stayed loose but ready, spoke louder than any shout. It was the calm before a storm, the kind of threat that didn't need to raise its voice. It simply was. Luis was the first to break, sprinting toward the far truck with a desperation that bordered on panic. Javier followed, scrambling to snatch his rifle from the ground with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Only Mateo held his ground, though his forced grin was cracking, his confidence leaking out like water through a broken dam. "You think you can scare me, viejo?" he barked, his voice sharp but brittle, betraying the fear clawing at his insides. "You're just a—" His words died when Harold's gaze locked onto his trembling hand. "You've been holding your breath every 7 seconds, Harold said softly, his voice almost gentle, like he was stating a simple fact. "A sign of cocaine use, your right hand's twitching. You're already in withdrawal. You're not thinking clearly." Mateo's lips parted, but no sound came out. His bravado was gone, replaced by a dawning realization that he was out of his depth. "You won't win this fight," Harold finished, his words landing like a final judgment. Another beat of silence stretched out, taut as a bowstring. Then a faint clink broke it, Mateo's pistol hitting the dirt. "We're leaving," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper as he backed away, his eyes never leaving Harold's. The others were already gone, their trucks roaring to life in the distance, leaving only dust and the echo of their retreat. The cartel men piled into their battered trucks, their faces grim with frustration. "Ain't nothing worth stealing here," one of them spat, his voice thick with disdain as he slammed the door. Engines roared to life, tires screeching as they tore away from Harold Finch's ranch, kicking up clouds of dry, choking dust that swirled like a storm in their wake. Harold stood motionless in the driveway, his weathered hands hanging loosely at his sides, his eyes unyielding as the dust rolled past him, a fleeting veil marking the end of a tense confrontation. In his heart, a quiet resolve burned. He'd faced worse than this, and he'd face it again if need be. The message was unmistakable. You don't step into a lion's den and walk away unscathed. The next morning, long before the sun climbed high enough to warm the earth, a procession of dusty trucks began snaking down the narrow road toward Harold's ranch. First came Sarah Thompson, the school teacher, her arms cradling a wicker basket filled with warm cornbread, its buttery aroma mingling with the crisp dawn air. She moved with purpose, her heart heavy with gratitude for the man who'd quietly kept their small town grounded. Behind her were the Watson twins, lanky teenagers Harold had once pulled from the raging floodwaters of Cutter's Creek, their young faces set with determination as they hauled nails and plywood from their father's old pickup. Last in line was Jenny Lee, her truck bed overflowing with tools, rolls of wire, and fencing supplies. Her eyes bright with the kind of loyalty that doesn't need words. She'd never forgotten how Harold had helped her rebuild her barn after the fire, asking for nothing in return. Within an hour, Harold's front porch was a hive of activity. No one knocked or waited for an invitation. They simply got to work, sweeping up shards of broken glass that glinted in the morning light, righting overturned furniture, stacking firewood in neat piles, and hammering nails into sagging siding. It wasn't pity that drove them. It was respect, deep and unspoken, for a man who'd never asked for recognition. Harold stood among them, his presence steady but quiet, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and unease. He wasn't used to being the one helped, and the weight of their gratitude settled on him like an unfamiliar coat. By midday, the low rumble of engines announced the arrival of Sheriff Wilson's cruiser, trailed by three more in a National Guard vehicle. Its olive green bulk a stark contrast to the dusty ranch. The sheriff stepped out, his face lined with both resolve and regret, flanked by a dozen deputies in crisp tan uniforms. He tipped his hat as he approached Harold, his boots crunching on the gravel. "We came as soon as we heard, Harold," he said, his voice heavy with the guilt of arriving too late to stop the cartel's raid. "I'm sorry we weren't here sooner." Harold stood on his porch, a chipped mug of coffee in his hand, the American flag behind him snapping sharply in the morning breeze. The lines etched into his face seemed deeper today, carved by years of silent burdens, but his posture remained unbowed, a testament to a life spent standing tall. "It's handled," he said, his voice low and even, carrying the weight of a man who'd already settled the matter in his own way. The sheriff nodded, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "I figured as much," he replied, his tone laced with respect. As the day wore on, more townsfolk arrived, drawn by a shared sense of duty. Mr. Mott Chen, who ran the grocery store Harold had kept open during the blackout, arrived with a crate of canned goods, his quiet gratitude evident in the way he met Harold's gaze. Evelyn Parks came next, her hands trembling slightly as she recalled how Harold had built a wheelchair ramp for her husband, a small act that had restored dignity to their lives. Families from town, farmers with calloused stones, children with wide eyes, and veterans in faded jackets and caps worn thin by time, all gathered in front of Harold's porch, standing shoulder to shoulder in a silent show of solidarity. No one spoke at first, the air thick with unspoken stories of Harold's quiet heroism. Then, a man stepped forward, his jacket bearing a Vietnam patch, its edges frayed but proud. He raised a hand in a crisp salute, his eyes locking with Harold's, conveying a brotherhood forged in hardship. Another veteran followed, then another, until a dozen stood in a line, some young, some old, some limping, others scarred but unyielding. Each raised a salute to the man who'd never spoken of his own service, never boasted of his sacrifices. Harold's chest tightened as he looked out at them, the weight of their respect pressing against the walls he'd built around his heart. He'd never asked for thanks, never shared the stories that haunted his sleepless nights. But stories have a way of slipping out, like a breeze finding its way under a door. And now the town knew the man they'd lived beside for years. Harold's eyes, sharp and proud, scanned the crowd, the people he'd protected, served, and never expected anything from in return. In that moment, words felt unnecessary, almost inadequate. He gave a single nod, a gesture that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken thanks, and it was enough. As the sun dipped low, painting the ranch in long golden shadows, the chaos of the previous day faded into memory. The only sounds were the soft creak of wood underfoot, the occasional sharp strike of a hammer, and the gentle rustle of wind weaving through the cottonwood trees. Most of the crowd had drifted home, their work done, but one man remained. Captain Owen Rees stood beside Harold, his sleeves rolled up, sweat streaking the back of his neck as he tightened a hinge on the battered front gate. "Sturdy as hell," Owen said, testing the gate's swing with a satisfied nod, his voice warm with admiration. "Kind of like the guy who lives here." Harold's lips curved into a rare half-smile, and he handed Owen a rusted screwdriver, its handle worn smooth by years of use. They worked in companionable silence, two men who'd both carried the weight of the world, one younger, still grappling with its burdens, the other older, hardened by its trials. "You know," Owen said after a long pause, his voice thoughtful as he drove another screw into place, "folks don't always see what's right in front of them, but they see you now, Harold. They always will." In the fading light of an Arizona evening, Owen rubbed his calloused hands on his worn jeans, the fabric rough against his palms. His heart felt heavy, tangled with respect and curiosity for the man before him. "I always figured the best way to honor what we went through was to shout it from the rooftops," he said, his voice low but steady, "to make sure folks knew what happened, what we sacrificed." He glanced at Harold, hoping for a reaction, but the older man didn't lift his eyes. Instead, Harold's weathered hands moved with careful precision, brushing specks of desert dust from a battered mailbox he'd just secured to its post. The task seemed to anchor him, a quiet ritual in a world that often felt too loud. Owen's chest tightened as he watched Harold's deliberate movements. He'd come here seeking answers, driven by stories his father had told him, stories of a man who'd faced hell and walked away without a word. But now, standing in Harold's presence, Owen felt the weight of something deeper. "After meeting you, though," he continued, his voice softer, "I'm starting to see things differently." Harold's brush paused mid-stroke, and he turned, his gray eyes meeting Owen's. The air between them seemed to hum with unspoken truths. "Sometimes," Owen said, his words slow and deliberate, "silence speaks louder than any story ever could." Harold's face remained steady, but a flicker of something, maybe relief, maybe recognition, passed through his gaze. He nodded, the gesture small but heavy with meaning. Owen felt a surge of awe for this man who carried so much without ever asking for recognition. Harold's silence wasn't empty. It was a monument, built from years of sacrifice and unspoken pain. After a long pause, Harold spoke, his voice rough, like gravel, but steady as stone. "I didn't vanish because I was ashamed," he said, his eyes drifting to the horizon where the sky bled orange and pink. "I left because I'd already given all I had. I fought so others could move on, so they wouldn't have to carry the same shadows." His words landed like a confession, raw and unguarded. Owen's throat tightened as he imagined the battles Harold had faced, not just on distant fields, but in the quiet moments when memories crept in uninvited. "That's the whole point," Harold added, his voice softer now. "We carry the burden, so they don't have to." Owen sank onto the porch steps, the wood creaking beneath him, its splinters a testament to years of neglect, yet stubborn endurance. He thought of his father, a man who'd spoken of Harold with reverence, his voice thick with gratitude. "My dad used to tell me about you," Owen said, his gaze fixed on the cracked boards beneath his boots. "He said you saved his life, pulled him out of chaos when everything was falling apart. And he said you never once brought it up afterward, like it was just another day." The memory stirred a mix of pride and sorrow in Owen's chidinau, a longing for a time when men like his father and Harold stood shoulder to shoulder against the world's darkness. Harold eased himself onto the step across from Owen, the movement slow and deliberate, as if his body remembered every ache from those long-ago days. The setting sun caught the jagged scar that traced his jaw, a pale line etched into his weathered skin. Owen wondered what story lay behind it, what moment of violence or bravery had left its mark. "I remember him," Harold said, his voice warm with a faint smile. "Your dad was a good man. Even when the world was burning around us, he'd find a way to laugh, like he was daring the darkness to try harder." The memory seemed to soften Harold's edges, and for a moment Owen glimpsed the younger man he must have been, resilient, loyal, unyielding. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the whisper of the desert wind and the faint groan of the old porch. The sky deepened to a bruised purple, and Owen felt a peace settle over him, a rare stillness that seemed to radiate from Harold himself. This was a man who'd seen the worst of humanity and chosen to protect its best, not with words, but with quiet, steadfast courage. Owen's heart swelled with gratitude, not just for Harold's service, but for his refusal to let it define him. "I'll keep your secret," Owen said at last, his voice firm with resolve. He meant it, not just the promise to stay silent, but to honor Harold's choice, to respect the life he'd built in this quiet corner of the world. "But I won't forget what you did." Harold nodded, slower this time, his eyes glinting with something like understanding. "Good, Bard," he said, a trace of humor creeping into his tone. "Just don't go building me a statue. I can't stand pigeons." For the first time in what felt like forever, a smile broke across Harold's face, weathered but genuine, like sunlight cracking through storm clouds. Owen chuckled, the sound easing the weight in his chest. In that moment, under the vast Arizona sky, a truth took root in his heart, stronger than the flagpole standing proudly on Harold's porch. Legacy wasn't built on noise or fanfare. It was forged in courage, in the quiet choices that shaped a better world. Harold Finch had never sought medals or applause. He'd fought so others could live free, suffered in silence so the next generation could dream without fear. In a world obsessed with shouting its victories, where every moment was captured and shared for likes and followers, Harold's life stood as a quiet rebuke. His strength didn't roar, it endured. His dignity lived in the small acts, the mailbox he'd fixed, the flag he raised each morning, the burdens he carried without complaint. Owen felt a spark ignite within him, a call to live with that same quiet bravery. Maybe it was in helping a neighbor mend a broken fence, or listening to a friend without judgment, or simply standing for something bigger than himself. As the stars began to pierce the twilight, Owen carried that spark with him, a reminder that honor didn't need a spotlight. It lived in the courage to do what was right, even when no one was watching. And somewhere in the stillness of that Arizona dusk, Harold Finch's legacy stood tall, not in statues or stories, but in the lives he'd touched, the peace he'd protected, and the quiet heroism that asked for nothing in return.